Abbott versus Beto. The stage now officially set for a fall clash to set the future course of the Lone Star State. Here at home, against the backdrop of an Election Day debacle, voters trim the field for the top job in Harris County down to 3. Which Latino candidate will ultimately rise above the rest in the eyes of voters? And as inflation rages, crime escalates, and the border remains far from secure, are Democrats and President Biden poised to pay a heavy price in the critical midterm elections to come? I'm Greg Groogan, and welcome to a special post-primary edition of What's Your Point, where our panelists call it like they see it. Let's greet them. Starting us off, Mark Jones, political analyst at Rice University. Next up, Jackie Bally, professor of political science at UH Downtown. In the 3 spot, Jasper Scherer, political reporter with the Houston Chronicle. Batting cleanup, Dr. Sergio Lira, president of Houston LULAC. And closing us out, well-known Houston political analyst and consultant, Keir Murray. Let's begin. With the primary election more or less in the Lone Star State's collective rearview mirror, it is certainly high time to look forward to the head-to-head runoffs in May and beyond to the critical midterm election this fall. It is hardly breaking news to project a rough outcome for Democrats, and by extension, President Joe Biden. The big question is how rough, and whether Democrats will lose their tenuous grip on the U.S. Senate in addition to the House. As any of our panelists will tell you, it's hardly uncommon for a first-term commander-in-chief to suffer a midterm setback, and yet for months, President Biden's approval rating has hovered in the low 40s, which clearly indicates he will have little, if any, coattails to offer Democratic incumbents and challengers. Panel, clearly voters are watching the president's handling of the Ukraine crisis closely, along with his ability to deliver relief from inflation, which is steadily gnawing away at household budgets. And one more hard fact, the opposition party has picked up 5 or more seats in 34 of 35 midterm elections dating back to the end of Reconstruction. And with that fact, I'm going straight to Mark Jones. How do you see the midterms shaking out, Mark?
Well, I think, as you mentioned, the House is lost for Democrats. The only question is, do they lose essentially by 5, 10, 15, 20 seats, or is it a massacre? Probably can't be a massacre given the heightened polarization, but I think we're looking at a House that will be where you have a strong Republican majority. Now means the focus will be then on the Senate, where Democrats are also looking pretty weak in states like Arizona, Nevada, New Hampshire, and Georgia, where they have to defend some pretty tenuous seats. And Republicans really only are all that weak in, say, Pennsylvania and maybe Wisconsin. So I think we're looking at a Senate that also could very well flip, and that would provide Republicans with the ability to have agenda control, in particular over any future Supreme Court nominations were any Supreme Court justice to pass or retire during the final 2 years of Biden's first term.
Jackie Bally, you keep in pretty good contact with the Republican establishment. Are they chomping at the bit to get to the midterms?
Republicans are definitely feeling energized and looking at the low 40% approval rate. And that started really when President Biden pulled out of Afghanistan, and he never really recovered from that. And now with our inflation rate at a 40-year high, people are looking at all of the policy points that the president has created in the short time that he's been in office. Even Democrats who are in swing states and are campaigning, they're trying to distance themselves from the president. So yes, Republicans are feeling energized and know for a matter of a fact that they are going to take back the House.
Keir Murray, with 7 months to work with, what would your advice be to folks who are in the Democratic Party who are going to face some big battles in the midterms?
Well, I think as has already been noted, historically, the election sets up pretty badly for Democrats, and I think they will suffer losses. How great those are remain to be seen. But I think what I would advise Democrats to do is hope for a couple of things. Hope that COVID continues to recede into the background, as it looks like it's starting to do now, that the economic recovery, inflationary issues notwithstanding, continues, good job growth, those sorts of things, that the president can continue to his good marks on his handling of the Ukraine crisis, and hope that the Republican enthusiasm peaked a year early. I think there's some indications that might be true, but again, I want to say that I do think it will be a challenging election for them, but I think there's some possibility to mitigate the losses to a manageable level.
All right, Jasper, do we have any battleground races in this midterm here in the Lone Star State?
Fortunately not. I think the Republicans at the State House kind of took care of all those for us last year during redistricting. Typically, when we were having this conversation, we'd be talking about how Democrats in battleground congressional districts around Texas and the Houston area would be, looking at some really tough elections, like Lizzie Fletcher, two-term incumbent comes to mind. A lot of other similar examples. She was redistricted into a safe seat. And, there are a lot of Republicans who, might have been trying to unseat Democrats in swing districts who end up just running for safe seats, and it creates more of the contest ends up happening essentially in the primaries. So we're seeing a lot of the actual true elections in these formerly battleground districts. The true battleground is basically happening right now in the primaries.
Okay, Sergio, what do you want to hear from both parties to earn your vote and the votes of Latinos as we go into these final 7 months before the midterms?
Well, the two things that resonate with the Latino voters here in large urban cities is the crime rate, the reduction in crime all across our large urban cities, from New York to Chicago to LA to Houston and Dallas. That is one thing that needs to be, definitely improved. The other issue is inflation. I mean, inflation is really hurting the pocket of folks who, live on a single family members, retirees, those in public service. The cost of living rate hasn't been adjusted. So these folks are suffering with the high rise of medical costs, the gas prices, all of this. Both sides need to do a better messaging and reducing the crime rate and also decreasing the inflation.
All right. Kier, Air Force One has landed at IAH. You're going to the White House. You got 30 seconds to give the president advice for the next 7 months. What can he do to improve his approval rating?
Again, I think handle the Ukraine crisis well. Continue to do what you can to mitigate inflation. It's difficult for a president to control that, and to foster continued economic growth in the U.S. and continue to try to move the country beyond COVID. I think Americans are fatigued by COVID and thinking about it and talking about it. It looks like from a caseload level, we're headed in the right direction. And to the extent he can look forward and have his government look forward and not backward in that regard, I think it will help the overall psychology of the electorate, again, to try to mitigate losses for November.
Going to leave it there. Still to come, the pivotal role of Hispanic voters in the Texas power balance. Is their collective allegiance shifting? But up next, the coming battle between Abbott and Beto. We're talking about who has the edge in the race for governor on the other side of this break. Welcome back. At the top of the Texas ballot come November will be the marquee battle for governor. Two-term Republican incumbent Greg Abbott coasted to his party's nomination with much of his $50 million war chest intact, along with a statewide power grid which managed to survive the hardest days of winter without collapsing. Abbott will face Beto O'Rourke, the former El Paso congressman who energized Texas Democrats back in 2018 during a failed but extremely consequential Senate run, which catapulted dozens of down-ballot progressives into office across the state. Panel, does this 2022 version of O'Rourke, nicked up by a short-lived presidential bid, have the stuff to fuel a serious challenge to Abbott? Mark Jones, call it like you see it.
No. Third time is not going to be a charm for Beto. He starts off in a state where the Republicans have an approximately 10-point advantage statewide. As we already mentioned, the Biden administration is an anchor around every Democrat's neck, dragging them down. And Beto 3.0 is not Beto 1.0 in that he went pretty far to the left on many issues in his failed presidential bid, and that's going to hurt him in his 2022 gubernatorial bid.
Jackie Bally, you agree with that?
Oh, I definitely agree. Look, we had 1.9 million people voting in the Republican primary, 1 million people voting in the Democrat primary. Governor Abbott in all polls is leading O'Rourke significantly. With men, he's leading. With women, they're pretty much divided. With every age group except for 18 to 29, he's leading Beto O'Rourke. And all the governor has to do is remind everyone that O'Rourke said, heck yeah, I'm going to take your guns. Heck yeah, I like open borders. That's all he has to do to remind them, and he will secure his victory.
Sergio, Beto has a Spanish nickname. He grew up on the border, and he speaks the language. Abbott, on the other hand, has a Mexican-American wife. Does any of that figure into this?
No, not really. I think it's just the dynamics of this race that's interesting. Beto has a lot of charisma. He motivates the Democratic base, as we saw what happened in 2018, and in particular in large urban cities in Texas. However, what's interesting, I don't think he's going to make it. I honestly do not think so. However, a lot of Democrats are excited. He's going to have a tremendous effect on two interesting races. Rochelle Garza for Attorney General, if she gets past Jaworski, and also Jessica Cisneros versus Cuellar. If they can both get past the runoff, it is going to be interesting because those are pro-progressive Latina women down from the border where voter turnout for Latinos is at about 40%. I think it's going to be interesting.
All right, Keir, I suspect you're not ready to throw the towel in on Beto quite yet.
Well, look, I would stipulate the advantage goes to Governor Abbott, but there are some signs that he's not as strong as he used to be. I think the results of COVID and the winter storm have clearly damaged him to some degree. He had a solid, okay, but pretty lackluster showing, frankly, in the Republican primary. Dan Patrick, for example, ran 10 points ahead of him in that race. And Beto looks like a somewhat different candidate in this go-around. He's not shied away from attacking Governor Abbott in his record, which I think will be important to his prospects. I do expect Governor Abbott likely to win, but I think he'll have to run a real race to do it.
All right, we're going to leave it right there. Coming up, inflation, crime, border security, and the fragile power grid. What hot-button issue will inspire Texas voters to actually vote? Stick around. Watch your point. We'll be right back. As the knee of a 2-year pandemic appears to be lifting off the nation's neck, voters here and across the country find themselves deeply troubled by a whole host of issues. Raging inflation, rising crime, much of it violent, a porous border through which uninvited immigrants and deadly drugs flow freely, deep and controversial restrictions to a woman's right to choose, new state election laws some see as suppressive, and fierce opposition over what should and shouldn't be taught in public schools. Panel, that list doesn't include concerns over national defense in the face of Russian and potentially Chinese military aggression. My question, what are the issues you sense are resonating most with voters? And Jasper Sher, you talk to Texas voters. What are you hearing out there?
I think on the local level, it's crime is the number one, number two, and number three issue in all the local races here, rising crime level that you were talking about. If you're, going to the statewide level, I think it's fair to say the border at the moment is probably up there at the top, especially in the context of these Republican primaries, some of which are still ongoing. And, I think we're talking about Beto O'Rourke's comments on guns earlier. I think some of the stances he took during his Democratic primary bid when he was courting a much different audience. I think on the border, some of those could kind of be tough for him to overcome in the general election.
All right, Sergio, I know because I had a conversation with your wife, what is the big talk around your table? Is it public safety?
Yes, of course. Crime does not discriminate. And as we've seen in the news on a weekly basis, the loss of innocent victims, felons out on bail bond, police officers being killed. I mean, these issues really hit home. These are the really important issues. And, the crime that's just sweeping our urban city, it's something that needs to be really addressed and tackled head on. That is the number one issue. COVID, of course, has always been an overarching issue, but it seems to be getting better. But the talk of the town in our neighborhood is crime, whether it's from undocumented folks, documented folks, and citizens that are out on bail.
Kira, I've got a number for you, 3.8% unemployment. That's almost full employment, in real terms. What can Biden and Democrats do with that in terms of making it something that voters will be attracted by?
I mean, my view is that voters largely vote on how they feel, not on sort of intellectual issues, right? And a lot of this has to do with the basic psychology of the public. How do they feel about American society? Crime is a big part of that, has been mentioned. COVID going away can be a part of that. But it's the bread and butter kitchen table issues for most Americans. Am I making enough money? What am I paying at the pump or at the grocery store? So do I have a job that pays well? Have I gotten a raise? So to the extent that those kitchen table issues can be headed in the right direction, and again, there's some indications that they are, the big question mark is inflation, particularly with gas prices and this conflict, but also just more generally, can that come under control to give Americans a better feeling overall about their everyday, day-to-day life?
Jackie Balley, candidates on the red side, they value your advice. What are you telling them?
Look, with a 35% increase in homicides in Houston, we've now surpassed LA and New York and they have populations much larger than ours. And the fact that 156 lives have been lost because felons have been released on poor bail policies. That is the key issue that's being tackled from the state level, definitely in the Houston region, at the Houston region level as well.
All right, Mark Jones, bring it home. You got a full minute.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've asked about this in a recent University of Houston Hobby School poll. What we found is that it really differs depending on your partisanship. For Republicans, border security was the top issue, followed by economic issues. For Democrats, we found that voting rights was actually a very strong issue, along with health care. What really isn't a major issue in terms of dividing is abortion anymore, because both sides are pretty much set in their ways. That is, Republicans are pretty strongly in favor of the current abortion legislation, which is a de facto ban on abortion after 6 weeks in Texas. And Democrats want to go back to the Roe v. Wade rules that were enforced, theoretically enforced in the rest of the country. So I don't think abortion is going to be a strong issue. As we get towards November, though, I think we can expect to see Abbott continue to focus on crime as well as border security, because those are winning issues for him.
All right, we're going to leave it right there. Up next, under what seems like an ever-present cloud of criminal investigation, incumbent Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton advances to a runoff. Question now, what can challenger George P. Bush say or do to convince Republicans to make a major change? And then there were two. Embattled incumbent Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton was the top vote getter in the March 1st primary, despite being the subject of a long, lingering criminal indictment and a fairly fresh federal probe into alleged bribery. He will face outgoing Land Commissioner George P. Bush in a runoff, although some have called the nephew of one president and the grandson of another the most poorly positioned politically of Paxton's three primary challengers. Panel, also feel free to opine on the prospects of Democratic frontrunner Rochelle Garza. I'm going to start with you, Jasper, because you're probably going to have to cover this race.
Yeah, I mean, there's where to even start with this one. I think there's just a number of hurdles that Bush is going to have to overcome. His family name, sort of Paxton already is signaling he's going to push pretty hard on that element, promising that this is kind of an opportunity to end the Bush political dynasty. Clearly that holds some sway among the, more conservative voters. And, if you look at the outcome of the March primary, we like to say, if an incumbent is forced into a runoff, that means the majority of voters voted against them. But in this case, one of Paxton's primary opponents, Louis Gohmert, congressman from East Texas, is kind of seen as the most politically aligned with Paxton. Paxton has been saying, expressing confidence that Gohmert's voters will, go over into his camp in the runoff. So I think it's a steep hill for Bush to climb, and we'll see if he's able to do it.
Jackie, Louis Gohmert was on our air last Sunday. Woo! He said Paxton has become comfortable with lying. He said that his former girlfriend has turned state's evidence, and that the guy who was given his campaign money has also turned state's evidence and that Democrats are just waiting to drop an indictment. Does that scare Republicans, you know?
No. I often have said that Paxton is like Teflon, nothing sticks. Even though this indictment has been looming and we've heard rumors for the last 6 years, Republican primary voters love his tenacity. They love the fact that he has a rough edge to him. The fact that former President Trump endorsed him is only icing on the cake. They think he is the one that can fight for Texas in D.C. Definitely if D.C. is filled with a lot of liberals. So yes, these rumors continue to circle around. The Democrats are going to pounce probably as soon as Paxton wins his primary, but Republican primary voters are just rallying around him even more.
Mark, you picked Rochelle Garza early, and she was dominant.
Yeah, she has strong support, and that will be the Democrats' best hope to end the losing streak that dates back to 1996. Last Democratic statewide victory was 1994. The best hope will be against a weak Ken Paxton, who clearly is the weakest member of the Republican herd in November. With the Biden administration not doing so well, it's going to be tough, but that's a race where I think between Joe Jaworski and Rochelle Garza, where Democrats need to pay attention and figure out who their best candidate is. Rochelle Garza has a lot going for her, and she's especially helped by the fact that most of the competitive Democratic primaries runoffs that will take place in May are all occurring in South Texas. District 28, District 15, District 34, and a county judge race in Bexar County, and a Senate 27. That's all occurring in her sort of neck of the woods. So Jaworski's going to have to do a lot of work statewide and north of the South Texas to have a chance.
All right, quickly, Sergio, do people know who Rochelle Garza is? You got about 20 seconds.
Well, they're starting to get to know her. I mean, she's been endorsed by a lot of Democratic elected officials here in Houston and South Texas. But the good news is that whatever happens with George P. Bush, it's going to be a plus for Rochelle Garza. And it's just going to energize her base. And the progressive Latina women down there in South Texas are going to be really, really pouncing on Paxton.
Frankly, it's flat out impossible to live in Texas without having friends, coworkers, and often family members who possess some measure of Hispanic heritage. The latest census places our state's Latino population at about 40%. Once largely and reliably Democratic voters, there appears to be an ongoing partial shift, particularly in the Rio Grande Valley and other counties along the border. And it's not just there. Suburban Latinos also appear to be splitting their alliance more evenly between the two parties. Panel, if there is any validity to the trend I have just laid out, Democratic hopes of turning Texas blue are in some very significant trouble. I'm going to you, Keir Murray. What do you think of this suggestion?
Well, I think it's clear that in 2020 there was measurable erosion in performance by Democrats in Texas with Latino voters. That's, it's in the 8 to 10 point on average range. What I would hesitate to do is call that a trend. It's one election. And we've seen this in the past, 20 years ago with George W. Bush, who performed well with Latino voters here in Texas, only to have many of them revert back to voting for Democrats later on. I'm not saying that'll happen again, but I simply think it's too soon to say whether this is a trend. But it's definitely something that Democrats ought to take seriously in their approach to these increasingly swing voters.
If there's any difference, it's the crisis on the border. You have border communities that are absorbing large numbers of people, and it's tough on their infrastructure, it's tough on their schools, and they're pushing back. And a lot of those families have employment in law enforcement and the Border Patrol. Sergio, got to go to you on this. What's your take?
Well, I definitely see a shift in terms of switching parties. And also, there's several waves of immigrants. You have the poor immigrants from Central America that are just getting here, just looking for work and trying to live the American dream. But then you have another wave of immigrants that are mostly middle-class folks that are come from Venezuela, South American countries, or even from India and other countries who come here where business, pro-business, anti-tax is something that resonates with them. And they don't have a long historical context with the civil rights movement here in America. So therefore, they're more inclined to become more Republican. And I'm noticing that shift when I meet with my friends who are up middle class or upper middle class Latinos, they tend to be more Republican. And so it's obviously happening, but Republicans are doing a great job in messaging and working to get that Latino vote, something that the Democrats need to do much better.
Okay, little known fact, Mark Jones speaks Spanish probably as good or better than Sergio Lira. Mark, what's your take on this issue?
Well, no, I think what's key for the future of Texas politics is the Latino population. If Texas Republicans continue to win between 40 and 45% of the Latino vote, then barring significant shifts in the Anglo vote, they will continue to be the majority party. If, on the other hand, Democrats are able to get the Latino vote for Republicans down to 20 or 25%, that's when you start seeing Democratic majorities. And I think both parties realize this. Republicans have, though, been, I think, more proactive now in working to win over the Latino vote. And we see that, for instance, recently in Harris County, when I just did a look at judicial races. Republicans have 17% of their county judicial candidates are Latino, only 14% on the Democratic side.
All right, Jasper Scherer, I'm assuming you're going to do some reporting on this. But look, have Democrats in this day and age, 2022, moved too far to the left on the value issues to I guess, hold Texas Hispanic residents?
I think we saw a lot of evidence of the, Democratic officials sort of reacting to this trend. For instance, last legislative session, there were, a number of Democrats who represented border districts in the House and Senate who voted for, essentially tripling the state's investment in border security, among other examples. So I think, we're seeing some of the folks who are, who live in those communities, who are, Latino Democrats themselves, they've got their, they kind of have their, finger on the pulse and are reacting the way that you might expect them to. But, it'll be interesting to see if, statewide candidates like Beto O'Rourke, we've seen him, struggle in those, counties at times, like in the 2018 primary. So, I think those are the Democratic candidates to really keep an eye on.
Jackie, I've got 20 seconds for you. The Republican camel's nose is under the tent. Are you going to exploit it?
Look, Latinos and Hispanics are not a monolithic group. They're individual people, and they like the messaging of free enterprise and less regulation, less taxation. As immigrants, they like the opportunity to come to this country, work from the ground up, and do the best they can. I understand that as an immigrant myself, and that's why the Republican Party continues to grow with the Latino and Hispanic base.
Welcome back. Note to those engaged in the political process, it's pretty damn good to have some military combat service on your resume. Latest case in point, former Navy SEAL Morgan Luttrell, who demolished 11 other contenders seeking to succeed the retiring Kevin Brady in reliably Republican Congressional District 8. Now add former Army chopper pilot Wesley Hunt, who easily prevailed in the newly formed Congressional District 38 and is slated to coast in the fall. Those two former service members will join decorated Navy SEAL Dan Crenshaw and Iraq War veteran Troy Nehls in a sort of half moon of GOP ex-military congressional representation dominating the Houston suburbs. Panel of the District 8 race was also a pretty nasty intramural proxy war between the Christian Collins backing Ted Cruz and the Luttrell supporting Crenshaw. Going to you on this, Mark, what do you think?
Well, I think it shows you, especially when attacked from the right, being a veteran is like Kevlar. And so people like Luttrell were able to deflect a lot of the critiques, but he also had the advantage. He was backed by Dan Crenshaw, Dan Patrick, Rick Perry, and he pretty much crushed the Christian Collins, beating him by 30 points, as well as getting over 50%, which it was tough to do with that large fragmented field.
Okay, Kira, what do you think of my theory here?
I think there's some validity to it. I mean, look, older men in particular, are dominant voting bloc in the Republican primary. So it's not surprising to me that veteran candidates like these with military backgrounds are appealing to that voting bloc.
All right, Jasper, I know you kept your eye on this race. Your thoughts? I'm talking about District 8.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think a just as important parallel, and in addition to the military service, was the support that Luttrell and Wesley Hunt both got from House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. He was, especially behind Luttrell, kind of poured a lot of money into that race through a super PAC that really helped Luttrell compete with a lot of the outside money that Collins was getting from a separate super PAC that was aligned with the House Freedom Caucus. So super PACs all over the place, but it seems like the McCarthy influence was really, kind of a big deal in Texas 8. And on the flip side, a big deal for McCarthy. He gets 2 new supporters, and seems like he's going to be going for the speakership. So there's that too.
All right, Jackie, what's the scuttlebutt about the Crenshaw-Cruz proxy battle?
Well, first of all, I want to go back to, we'll answer your question. I want to go back to something that's being ignored. A lot of these military men have a lot of discipline. They have a lot of attributes that they had while they were in the military, and they're transferring that on the campaign trail. I saw it firsthand when Troy Nels was running, and now his twin brother, Trevor Nels, is running for county judge out in Fort Bend County. It's precision, it's discipline, it's determination, the same attributes that they had when they were in the war. Going back to your question, it makes sense that with Dan Crenshaw, he's already been established in his community. He is moving forward in the Republican Party. Ted Cruz has been someone who's been in Fort White and been in the light for the longest time. So it's going to see the 2 men work together.
Going to leave it there. Still to come. It's being called the worst run election in Harris County history. Monster delays, missing ballots, and plenty of political fallout. Our panel unpacks the repercussions of a primary gone wrong when we return. We are all still grappling with the sheer depth of dysfunction that painfully unraveled around Harris County's primary election. A quick recap of the lowlights. Harris was the only Texas county unable to count all of its ballots before the state's 24-hour deadline expired. Election Administrator Isabel Longoria later assured a judge that while egregiously tardy, all the votes were accounted for, only to learn that no fewer than 10,000 early ballots had been somehow misplaced and never counted. A discovery made not by her staff, but by the Secretary of State's office. Panel, before this epic fail, the Independent Election Division was touted to bring accuracy, reliability, and efficiency. Tuesday, the axe fell as Longoria announced her resignation under very, very heavy pressure. Mark, what's your assessment?
Well, it was a debacle. As you mentioned, 253 other counties got it right. Harris County did not. Now, that doesn't mean that having an appointed election administrator is a bad idea. In theory, it can work very well, as we see in so many other counties. However, the way this process was pushed through as a hyper-partisan 3-2 vote over the objections of all Republicans and many Democrats was not the best way to go. And clearly, when Lena Hidalgo, Adrian Garcia, and Rodney Ellis chose the current administrator, they made a bad choice.
Kira, you're the veteran of many elections. How do they best recover from this?
Well, I think, Ms. Longoria holding herself accountable today and probably doing the right thing and stepping aside was a good first step. I think the Commissioner's Court has said that they intend to engage a third-party consultant to get to the bottom of exactly what happened and to make corrections in time for the November election, which is critical to restore voter trust in the system prior to a high turnout general election that we're likely to see in November.
That was terrible. I'm not talking about you, Keir. That's the direct quote from Sergio Lira yesterday when we talked about this issue. What's your take?
Well, Ms. Longoria is a nice person, but it was an issue of experience. This was just unacceptable. She mentioned that, this is common in Harris County. No, it's not. I remember that we would finish by 7 p.m. at the polls working. By 9 p.m., we knew most of the results, and by 10 o'clock, folks were celebrating or going to bed early. This is not common. But I do want to say that whoever they appoint or they select the 5 committee members, make sure they get an urban cowboy that knows how to do the 2-step. Because let me tell you why. There was a 2-step in the voting precinct where you had to fill in the paper and then they were getting stuck, and then you had to take it to another polling to make sure that it's accounted for, and that lack of clerks there. So there was a 2-step process at the precinct, but also a 2-step process for the missing ballots. How can you miss 10,000 ballots from being tabulated and transferred over as the unofficial results? So let's just get a great urban cowboy with experience on knowing how to do the 2-step.
We know one thing for sure, the next elected judge of Harris County will be Latinx. Democratic incumbent Lina Hidalgo moved easily past her primary opponents to face a Republican challenger in the fall. That will be either well-known businessman and attorney Vidal Martinez or top vote-getter Alexandria Del Moral Mealer, a West Point grad and Afghan war vet with degrees from both Harvard Law and Harvard Business School. Panel, while Martinez has more history in Harris County, Mealer seems to have the momentum, and frankly, the potential Latina versus Latina matchup with Hidalgo is intriguing. Starting with you, Sergio, you got 30 seconds.
Oh, no, I'm looking forward to this race. No, this is probably one of the most interesting races here in Harris County. I think Miller has an edge. She's a Army veteran. She's highly educated. You know, I think it's going to be. However, Vidal Martinez is well known in the community. His experience, his personality. He's a great guy. So it's going to be interesting. But if Miller wins, what I'm really looking forward is to two Latinas in the November election. That is going to be very exciting.
Jackie Bally, 20 seconds for you.
Extremely excited. Vidal Martinez is a wonderful man, decades of service in our community. Then you have Mealer, who has the youth energized behind her. The military characteristics that we talked about earlier, she definitely has those as well. She's been guided by former Harris County Commissioner Steve Raddick. It'll be very good to see if Vidal wins. He would have carried like a statesman, like we saw with former Harris County Judge Ed Emmett. If Mealer wins, she's got the eye on the prize and she's hungry. So for Republicans, it's a win-win situation.
Yeah, but can either one of them beat Hidalgo? First to you, Jasper Scherer.
Well, I think, we were talking about the, Beto O'Rourke's chances statewide. And, I think one way to look at his effects, down ballot, he could kind of end up being something of a martyr. Maybe he comes up short against Abbott, but ends up helping preserve, folks like Lina Hidalgo's chances in a really tough year for Democrats. So that's one way to look at it. I think clearly Hidalgo has a lot of, headwinds herself. We were talking about the crime issue, and, she clearly was trying to nip the issue in the bud politically on the election debacle. So, clearly not a smooth sailing path to victory for her.
All right, Mark Jones, I've been working with you a long time. You've only gotten one race wrong in all those years. Forget that. Handicap this one.
Well, I think all the advantage still is with Hidalgo, but it will be a good test because, in Harris County, Democrats start off with a 10 to 12 point advantage. So in spite of an unpopular President Biden and in spite of Hidalgo essentially governing as an unabashed progressive, she still has the advantage. It will be a test, though, if Harris County has really turned blue or not. Because if Republicans can't win this year, then I think we can probably say that Harris County is blue. So Hidalgo will be a good test of that.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Still to come, a new kind of bias may be emerging among Democratic voters. We're set to discuss the political headwind facing white male candidates seeking support in the so-called Progressive Party. Welcome back. Democratic candidate for Lieutenant Governor Mike Collier is headed to a May runoff. The former accounting executive came within 4 points and change of displacing Republican Dan Patrick in 2018 and has been fiercely campaigning for months for another shot. Despite his strong past performance and legitimate qualifications, Collier must postpone his head-to-head fight with the incumbent and focus first on beating Michelle Beckley, a hyper-progressive state house member with little chance of attracting moderate voters. My point, panel, these days, unless you are Beto O'Rourke, it's very, very tough to win a Democratic primary outright if you happen to be a white male. Agree or disagree, Keir Murray?
It's true. For one thing, the Democratic primary electorate in Texas is now 60% plus women. And so particularly in generic down ballot races where the candidates are not well known, the default will be for women to vote for women. And so I think, Collier has a good sign in that he ran 10 points ahead or so of Beckley in the first round. He should have a good shot to win the runoff, but it won't be easy. He's going to have to garner as many endorsements, raise as much money, and do as much voter contact as he possibly can.
Mark, what do you think of this topic, this suggestion?
Well, I think as Keir points out, it really becomes important the lower you get down the ballot and the less information voters have about the candidates. at a point on the ballot where they're simply voting based on, in the primary, based on gender and race or ethnicity as they perceive it, since 60% of primary voters are women, women are going to win outright. And we see that in Harris County in the judicial races. Anglo males simply lose all of them. It's almost impossible if someone's running against them. Collier, though, I think is lucky in this situation in that Michelle Beckley is also a somewhat flawed candidate who a majority of Texas Democrats don't want to have as their standard bearer for lieutenant governor. So I think we're going to see most of the establishment rally behind Collier as the candidate in order to make sure that Beckley is not there representing the party in November.
Senator, you talk to a lot of people, and progressive Democrats, are they just saying, look, white guys have had their shot for a long time, they need to make room?
Yeah, that's what I'm hearing. What I've been hearing from young Latina progressives is that, they've had their chance, and and our city's a mess. So it's up to us. This group is more educated. They're more wealthier. They're more politically savvy. So they're really winning a lot of races, and white men are losing. I mean, if it's just like Mr. Jones said, it was so indicative in our judicial races. All the white men lost, but also a white woman lost. Abigail Anastasio lost, and also black females are winning and replacing white men.
All right, Jasper, do you have anything to add here? 15 seconds for you.
Yeah, I think it's an undeniable trend, not just this year. You go back to some of those judicial down ballot races, 2018, 2020. It's clearly a trend, but like Mark was saying, with folks like Collier, there are a lot of other factors at play too. So it's going to go probably beyond just that one issue.
All right, Jackie, one-word answer. Will the Republicans welcome back those moderate white Democratic men?
We welcome them with open arms, just like President Trump did.
Thanks for joining us. The conversation continues on a national level next with Fox News Sunday. I want to thank my panel. They were awesome. From all of us here, have a safe and healthy week.